I'm Jake, 32, and I've always tried to avoid talking about money with my family because every time the topic comes up, something gets weird. I grew up thinking my dad and I had a pretty straightforward relationship, even though he's always been a little distant and a little too involved with my younger brother. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a bunch of small things that stacked over the years, like the way he talked to him, the things he bought for him, the stuff he expected from me. Still, I tried not to overthink it, telling myself families work in strange ways, and it's better not to pick apart every detail. This year he turned 61, and my stepmom insisted on throwing a dinner at this place he loves, a small Italian spot he swears has the best lasagna in the state. I wasn't dying to go, but it felt like one of those things you just show up for because it's your dad. The day itself had been normal for me, nothing that hinted the night would end up being one of the most uncomfortable moments I've ever had. I got to the restaurant early because I hate being the last one to arrive anywhere. When I walked in, I could already hear my family talking loudly from across the room, which was pretty normal for them. My cousin Mark was there even though he barely shows up to anything unless there's food. My aunt, his mom, sat next to him, already giving instructions to the waiters like she owned the place. My brother looked relaxed, which immediately put me on guard because he only gets that way when he knows something I don't. My stepmom was smiling too much, the kind of forced smile she uses when she wants everyone to pretend we're a close family. I sat down in the only open seat left, right between Mark and my brother, which already felt like a setup. Everyone was making small talk about work and vacations they'd never actually take. I tried to blend in and not draw attention because the night wasn't about me. Still, I could feel this weird tension floating around the table, like people were talking around something. I assumed it was just my imagination because family gatherings always put me on edge. The waiter came over to take orders, and everyone acted like it was the warmest celebration we'd ever had. I kept nodding and playing along even though I felt disconnected from the whole thing. Maybe that's why, when the comment finally hit me, it felt like someone had thrown cold water over my back. I wasn't expecting anything dramatic from this dinner, but I guess that's how these things always happen. They sneak up when you think it's just another night. I had no idea the entire table was basically waiting for a reaction from me. And I definitely didn't expect Mark to be the one to drop the line that would shut the whole place down. We were halfway through the appetizers when Mark leaned back in his chair like he was gearing up to say something important. I noticed him watching me on and off all night in that nosy way he has, but I didn't think much of it because he's always fishing for gossip. My dad was cutting into his plate, my stepmom telling a story nobody really cared about, and my brother scrolling on his phone under the table. Everything looked normal, or at least normal for us. Then Mark asked it, loud enough for the entire table to hear, and even the waiter who was passing by slowed down. "So you finally got the house?" he said, like it was the most casual question ever. I froze because I genuinely didn't know what he was talking about. My brain went blank in that way it does when you're trying to decide whether you misheard something. A second later, I realized everyone else had gone completely silent. I looked around and saw my brother staring at his plate, my stepmom tightening her grip on her wine glass, and my dad not even lifting his head. It felt like they all knew exactly what Mark was referring to, except me. My stomach dropped, and I felt this rush of heat in my face, the kind that shows up right before anger or embarrassment. The worst part was that Mark wasn't even trying to be rude. He looked genuinely confused about why I wasn't answering. I managed to say I didn't know what he meant, but the words came out thin, like they barely made it out of my throat. The second I said it, people shifted in their seats like the air had gotten too heavy. I could feel eyes bouncing between me and my dad like they were waiting for him to step in and clear things up. But he didn't. He just kept cutting his food slowly, not looking at anyone, especially not me. It was like he was pretending he didn't hear anything, which made it 10 times worse. My stepmom took a deep breath, the kind she takes before she tries to lie her way through something. My aunt looked offended, like she'd stumbled into drama she wasn't prepared for. I was caught between confusion and something that felt a lot like betrayal. Because if there was a house involved, I should have known. And the fact that everyone except me reacted like this was old news made the whole thing even more surreal. That moment stretched out longer than it should have, and I felt trapped in my own seat. I didn't know it yet, but that question was just the edge of a mess I didn't ask to be part of, and it was about to get a lot uglier. As soon as I asked Mark what he meant, he looked at me like I was joking. He laughed a little under his breath, the kind of laugh someone gives when they think you're being dramatic. He said something about the house Dad's been talking about for months, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. I felt this weird wave of dizziness because I couldn't tell if someone was messing with me. Meanwhile, my brother kept shifting like he wanted to disappear under the table. He finally mumbled something like, "Just drop it," but his voice cracked in that guilty way he always gets when he's hiding something. My aunt looked right at my dad and asked if there was something I wasn't supposed to know. That was the moment my dad finally looked up from his plate, but he still didn't look at me. He just said everything was fine, which somehow made the tension worse instead of better. My stepmom leaned toward him and whispered something, but she wasn't quiet enough. I heard her say he wasn't ready yet. I don't know why that line bothered me so much, but it stuck in my head like a splinter. I asked again what house everyone was talking about, and this time my voice came out sharper. People started looking at their laps, pretending they weren't part of this conversation. My dad sighed the way he does when he thinks I'm overreacting. He said it was nothing, just a misunderstanding, and I should enjoy the dinner. But telling someone there's nothing to worry about while everyone acts like they're at a funeral doesn't help. The room felt smaller with every passing second. I kept replaying the past few months in my head, trying to remember if my dad ever mentioned anything about property. He hadn't. We aren't close enough for him to randomly give me a house, and if he did, it would have been some big family performance. So either Mark misunderstood something, or my family was hiding something from me. Neither option made me feel any better. I sat there, feeling the weight of everyone's silence pressing on me. It wasn't just a random comment anymore. It was clear there was something underneath it, something everyone except me seemed to know. And for the first time that night, I realized I wasn't going to get a straight answer from anyone at that table. After a minute of awkward silence, Mark leaned forward and lowered his voice like he suddenly realized he'd stepped into something messy. He said my dad had mentioned passing the house to me during a barbecue a couple months back, something casual, like future planning. I had no idea what house he was talking about because my dad rents the place he lives in now, and the only property he ever owned was sold after the divorce. My brain started scrambling through possibilities, trying to figure out if he meant some land, or maybe something from my grandparents, but none of it made sense. When I asked my dad again, more firmly this time, he just shook his head and told Mark he must have misunderstood. Mark looked genuinely confused because he insisted my dad had explained it in detail, even described the neighborhood, the color of the siding, the work it needed. I'd never even heard him talk about buying, inheriting, or planning anything like that. The more he described it, the more it sounded like he had a specific place in mind. My stepmom interrupted to say we should move on and enjoy the night, but her voice was strained, like she was scared the conversation would keep going. My aunt wasn't letting it go, though. She asked if there had been an inheritance or some sale we didn't know about. My dad got defensive in that irritated way he does whenever he feels cornered. He snapped that nothing was happening and everyone should eat. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, that mix of confusion and anger that makes it hard to think straight. If there was no house, why were they acting like this? And if there was a house, why was I the last to hear about it? I kept asking myself what exactly my dad had told Mark and why he'd talked to him about something he wouldn't talk to me about. It made me feel like some outsider at my own father's birthday dinner, like everyone had been having conversations behind my back. My brother tried again to steer the conversation away, but he looked pale like he knew the truth and wished he didn't. The whole table felt like it was collapsing under the weight of something unspoken. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was a whole story underneath this, and nobody wanted me to dig into it. It became clear that this wasn't a misunderstanding. Something happened, something they never planned on telling me. As the food came out, nobody touched their plates right away. The tension sat there like an extra guest at the table, and I could feel my heart beating faster than it should. I asked my dad one more time, calmly this time, to explain what Mark was talking about. He didn't look at me, just pushed his food around with his fork like a kid caught lying. My stepmom finally spoke up and said there was nothing official, just discussions, and that they didn't want to bring it up until they were sure about things. But that didn't explain why my cousin knew more than I did, or why Mark had specific details that didn't sound made up. My aunt asked if this had anything to do with the estate my grandfather left years ago, and that's when my dad's face changed. It was quick, but I caught it, like a flicker of panic. My brother muttered something under his breath and stood up to go to the bathroom, which is what he does when he wants to escape a conversation. I felt my throat tighten because it suddenly made sense that something big was being kept from me. Something involving property, decisions, and money, which always turns my family into liars. I asked straight out if my dad had inherited something and given it to someone else. My dad snapped and said no, but the way he said it wasn't convincing. My stepmom kept insisting we should stop ruining the night, but she looked more nervous than annoyed. Mark apologized quietly, saying he really thought I knew. But it was already too late. The damage was done. Everyone had shown their hand without meaning to. I sat there, feeling this heavy, sinking feeling that there was a truth floating around the family that somehow slipped past me. Not because they forgot to tell me, but because they chose not to. I didn't know what the house was or why it mattered, but I knew one thing. Whatever the story was, I wasn't supposed to hear it. At least, not that night. For the rest of the dinner, or whatever you want to call that tense mess we were sitting through, nobody really talked. People forced small comments here and there, but it was all fake, like everyone was just waiting for the night to end. My dad tried to act normal again, but he wouldn't look in my direction for more than half a second. My stepmom kept her eyes on her plate like she was scared I might ask her something directly. I felt physically present, but mentally somewhere else, trying to connect dots that didn't want to connect. It felt like someone had dropped a puzzle on the table, but kept half the pieces hidden. Every time I looked at my brother, he suddenly found something very interesting on the wall or the floor. I'd never seen him that nervous around me. He's usually the loudest, most carefree one out of all of us. Seeing him like that only convinced me more that this wasn't just a misunderstanding. At one point, Mark tried to bring up football scores, like that would magically erase the awkwardness. Nobody took the bait. Even the waiter seemed uncomfortable when he came back to refill water glasses. The whole dinner felt like a stage where everyone forgot their lines. I kept replaying my stepmom's whisper in my head. He wasn't ready yet. Ready for what? What was I supposedly going to find out eventually? Why did they get to decide when I was ready? It bothered me more than anything else that I had apparently been discussed behind closed doors. Discussed like a problem. Discussed like someone who couldn't handle basic information. By the time dessert came out, I couldn't eat a single bite. My stomach was twisted with confusion, anger, and this unsettling feeling of betrayal I couldn't fully explain yet. I just knew something was seriously off, and pretending everything was normal wasn't an option anymore. When the dinner finally wrapped up, people stood around awkwardly like they weren't sure if they should hug, leave, or keep pretending nothing happened. My aunt kept giving my dad this sharp look, like she wanted him to explain something but also knew he wouldn't. My brother stayed glued to the far end of the table, probably hoping nobody dragged him into the conversation. I stepped outside for some air while the restaurant staff cleaned the table. It was cold, but the fresh air felt like the only thing keeping me from snapping. I leaned against my car and tried to make sense of everything. There was no version of this situation that didn't end with my family hiding something from me. Not with the way they reacted. Not with the way they shut down. A minute later, my cousin Mark walked outside too, hands shoved in his pockets, looking guilty. He told me again that he genuinely thought I knew because my dad made it sound like a done deal. He described how my dad had talked about finally being fair, finally doing right by me, which only made the whole thing sting more. Fair about what? Right about what? Mark said he didn't want to get in the middle, but he also didn't want me thinking he'd made something up. I didn't blame him. He had no reason to lie about this. He even apologized again, which only made me angrier, not at him, but at my dad. I told Mark I appreciated him being honest, even if he hadn't meant to start anything. All he said before getting in his car was that my dad seemed proud when he talked about it. Those words didn't match the man inside the restaurant avoiding eye contact like a kid who broke a window. It only made things more confusing. I stood there watching Mark drive off, and for the first time, I felt this heavy shift inside me. I knew something had changed in my family that night, and there was no going back. After Mark left, I stayed outside for a few more minutes, letting the cold settle into my face as I tried to calm down. My brain was jumping from one theory to another, none of which made enough sense to ease the frustration building in my chest. Eventually, I saw my brother walk out of the restaurant, avoiding eye contact like he was walking through a crime scene. He muttered something about needing to leave early because he had plans, but his voice was too shaky to believe. I asked him straight up if he knew anything, but he shrugged and kept his eyes on his shoes. He said it wasn't his place to explain, which immediately pissed me off. Not his place. He's my brother, and if something involved me, Why wouldn't it be his place? I pressed him a little more, but he shut down completely and said I should talk to Dad. That was the last thing I wanted to hear. I didn't want another vague half-answer or a deflection. I wanted the truth, or at least a hint of it. But my brother made it clear he wasn't going to be the one to give it to me. He hugged me quickly, the kind of half-hearted hug you give when you're trying to escape, and then walked to his car without looking back. I watched him leave, feeling more alone in this mess than I expected. It was clear he knew something he wasn't allowed to say. That made everything worse. My family had agreed to keep me out of something, and they all seemed weirdly comfortable with that decision. The more I thought about it, the more it felt like a betrayal wrapped in secrecy. And the worst part was that I still didn't know what the secret even was. I didn't know if it was about money, inheritance, some old property, or something else entirely. All I knew was that I wasn't supposed to find out. Not yet, maybe not ever. But that wasn't going to sit well with me. Not after the way they acted that night. When I finally went back inside, my dad and stepmom were getting their coats on. My dad looked exhausted, like the dinner had drained him completely, but he still wouldn't look at me. I asked him quietly if we could talk for a minute. He sighed heavily and said it had been a long day and he didn't want to get into anything right now. That only fueled my frustration. I told him this involved me, whether he liked it or not. He finally looked at me, but only for a second, and said again that there was nothing to talk about. It felt like he was reading from a script he'd prepared in his head. I asked him point blank if there was a house he'd told Mark about. He hesitated just long enough to confirm everything without saying a word. My stepmom jumped in and said Mark misunderstood the situation, but her voice cracked halfway through the sentence. My dad mumbled something about future planning and not wanting to get hopes up, which made zero sense. Future planning for what? Why talk to Mark about it, and not me? Why give details about a house if nothing was real? He wouldn't answer any of it. He just kept repeating that it wasn't the right time. I told him it was a pretty strange thing to hide from your own son. He winced at that, like the comment hit harder than I intended. He said we'd talk another day, but the way he said it made me think that day would never come. My stepmom pulled at his arm gently, urging him toward the door, and he let her guide him out without another word to me. I stood there watching them leave, feeling like a stranger in my own family. I didn't follow them, didn't call out, nothing. I just let them walk away because I realized something important. Whatever the truth was, they had no intention of telling me willingly. When I finally left the restaurant myself, the cold night air felt harsher than before. I sat in my car with the engine off, staring at the steering wheel like it might give me answers. All the confusion I felt earlier had hardened into something heavier, something closer to anger. Not explosive anger, just that deep, steady kind that sits in your chest because something isn't right. I thought about calling my aunt to ask what she knew, but I stopped myself. She'd only tell me whatever version of the truth my dad wanted her to repeat. I knew how this family works. Everyone protects the main narrative, even if the narrative is built on half-truths. I sat there for a long time replaying every detail Mark mentioned. The neighborhood, the repairs, the way my dad supposedly said he was finally doing right by me. None of that fit into anything I knew about my life or my dad's. The more I tried to make sense of it, the more frustrated I felt. I kept asking myself what kind of father talks openly about giving his son a house to a random cousin, but won't even acknowledge it to his own kid. I wondered if this was about favoritism, punishment, guilt, or something even deeper. Eventually, I started driving home, but my mind wasn't on the road. It was stuck on that moment when Mark asked the question and the whole table fell silent. That silence told me everything I needed to know. They weren't shocked because the comment was wrong. They were shocked because it wasn't supposed to be said out loud. That realization sat with me the entire drive. By the time I got home, I knew I couldn't just let this go. Whatever the truth was, it was buried somewhere in conversations I'd been excluded from, and I was done being left out. When I got home that night, I didn't even turn on the lights at first. I just stood in the doorway, letting everything from dinner replay in my head. It felt like the kind of night that forces you to rethink your entire relationship with your family. I kept wondering how long they'd been talking about this supposed house without me knowing. A few weeks? Months? Long enough for Mark to confidently assume I was already living there. That part bothered me more than anything. It meant the conversations weren't brief or vague. They were detailed enough that my cousin felt comfortable bringing it up casually in front of everyone. I tossed my keys on the counter and sat down on the couch, feeling this weird mix of anger and sadness settling in. It wasn't even about the house specifically. It was the secrecy surrounding it. The fact that my own father could talk openly to extended family about something that involved me, but couldn't talk to me directly. I felt this heavy sense of exclusion, like I'd been quietly pushed to the outside of my own family circle. I tried to think about what Mark said, my dad wanting to finally be fair. Fair compared to what? Compared to how he treated my brother? Compared to all the years he barely acknowledged anything I achieved unless someone else praised it first? Every time I tried to make sense of it, more questions popped up. My phone buzzed twice, but I ignored it. I wasn't in the mood for half answers or forced apologies. I needed clarity, real clarity, not the vague mess I'd been handed that night. But the more I sat alone in my apartment, the more I realized I might never get the truth from them directly. Not unless something forced it out. And I wasn't sure I wanted to wait for that moment. Later that night, I finally checked my phone and saw 2 missed calls from my stepmom. No messages, which was strange because she normally sends long texts explaining everything before she even calls. Seeing her number made my stomach twist again. I didn't call back. I wasn't ready to hear whatever rehearsed version of the story she would try to feed me. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table trying to piece things together logically. If there really was a house, then where did it come from? My dad hasn't owned property in years. He's never mentioned saving up or investing in anything. He's always been the type to stress about bills and then randomly buy an expensive grill he doesn't need. So this didn't fit any pattern I knew. I started thinking about my grandparents again. My grandfather passed away almost 8 years ago, and at the time, everyone made it seem like there wasn't much left to divide. Just some savings, a few old tools, and sentimental stuff. But I never saw the paperwork. I just took their word for it, because I wasn't the type to fight over family money. Now I wasn't so sure. If my dad had inherited something back then and kept it quiet, that would explain the tension. It would also explain why my brother wouldn't say anything. He's always been my dad's favorite, and if they decided to keep something from me, he'd go along with it without asking questions. But then why would my dad talk about giving it to me? Why change his mind? Why tell Mark? None of it lined up. The more I thought about it, the deeper the hole got. It felt like trying to solve a puzzle without knowing what the picture was supposed to be. Around midnight, I finally caved and called my aunt. If anyone would slip up and tell me the truth, it would be her. She's terrible at keeping secrets when she feels excluded. She answered on the second ring, sounding a little too cheerful, probably because she'd been waiting for me to call. I asked if she knew anything about the house situation. There was a long pause before she said she wasn't sure what was real and what wasn't, which already told me she knew more than she wanted to admit. I pressed a little, trying not to sound angry, but I could hear the discomfort in her voice. She said my dad had mentioned something months ago about correcting past mistakes and making things right. I didn't know what that meant, but the phrasing bothered me. Past mistakes? I've lived my whole life being careful not to demand anything from him. And now suddenly he's talking about fixing mistakes he never admitted to making? My aunt said she didn't want to get involved, but she did say something that stuck with me. She said my dad seemed stressed every time the house topic came up, like it wasn't as simple as he made it sound. That made my chest tighten because it meant this wasn't just some sudden idea he had. There was weight behind it. Something complicated. Maybe even something messy. She apologized for not being more helpful, but I could tell she knew more than she was saying. When I hung up, I felt even more unsettled. The story kept changing depending on who I talked to. Nobody could give me a straight answer, yet nobody denied the house existed either. It felt like I was inching toward a truth nobody wanted uncovered. And that made me more determined, even if it also made me uneasy. The next morning, I woke up with that same heavy feeling in my chest. I didn't sleep well because every few hours I'd jolt awake thinking about some detail from the night before. I couldn't shake the image of my dad avoiding my eyes like he was scared of what I might ask next. He's never been the most open person, but this was different. This felt intentional. I made coffee, even though my stomach was too tight to drink much of it. I sat at the table again, staring at the steam rising from the mug, thinking about everything my aunt said. If my dad really had inherited something years ago, why hide it? Was he planning to give it to my brother instead? Did something happen that forced him to rethink it? Was the mistake my aunt mentioned something he did to me? Or something involving my mom before the divorce? The questions kept stacking on top of each other. By noon, I couldn't take sitting around anymore. I grabbed my keys and decided to drive to my dad's place. If he didn't want to talk on the phone, fine, I'd show up. On the drive over, My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my neck. It wasn't excitement or anger. It was dread, the kind you feel when you know the truth isn't going to be the truth you want. When I pulled up in front of his house, his car was there, but the blinds were closed. I knocked on the door and waited. Then knocked again. No answer. I tried calling him, but it went straight to voicemail. Even though I could see his shadow move past the living room window. That was the moment I realized this was bigger than I thought. Not only was he keeping something from me, he was actively avoiding me. I stood there on the porch for a long time, debating whether to keep knocking or just walk away. The longer I stood there, the more frustrated I got. He knew I was outside. He knew why I was there. And instead of opening the door, he chose to hide behind the curtains like a kid caught stealing cookies. I finally stepped back, staring at the house, trying to figure out what exactly he was protecting. After a minute, I walked around the side yard, hoping maybe he'd come out if he thought I'd left. That's when I saw something I hadn't noticed before, a for sale sign lying flat on the ground behind the trash bins. Not planted, not displayed, hidden. My stomach flipped. The sign looked new, like it had been taken down recently. I picked it up and saw a note stapled to the wooden stake. It had a realtor's name and a property address. Not my dad's address. Not anywhere I recognized. My hand started shaking a little as I typed the address into my phone. It pulled up a small, older-looking house on the opposite side of town. The photo matched almost exactly what Mark had described at dinner. My heart dropped into my stomach. There was a real house, a real listing, a real sale pending. And my name, according to Mark, was supposed to be attached to all of it. I stared at the address on my phone screen, unable to make sense of anything. I didn't know whether to feel relieved that it wasn't all in my head or furious that it confirmed my family had been hiding something major from me. The only thing I knew for sure was that my dad had lied. And the worst part wasn't even the lie itself. It was realizing he'd rather hide inside his house like a stranger than face me with the truth. That moment in the yard stuck with me because it felt like the first solid piece of truth I'd gotten since dinner. I walked back to my car gripping that folded sign like it might explain everything if I stared at it long enough. I kept searching the property listing on my phone, scrolling through pictures of an empty living room, a cracked driveway, and a backyard with an old swing set. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was real. It existed, and someone had been making plans around it without telling me. I sat in my car trying to calm down, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I tried to imagine the scenarios. Maybe my dad bought it secretly and panicked at the last minute. Maybe he told Mark his plans before they were final and got embarrassed when they fell through. Maybe he changed his mind and didn't want to admit it. But none of those explanations matched the way everyone reacted, like it was something bigger, something deeper. I kept thinking about the way my brother avoided me. The way my stepmom whispered that I wasn't ready. Ready for what? I drove away from my dad's neighborhood without any idea where I was going. I just needed space. I ended up in a grocery store parking lot, sitting there like someone who'd just been told their whole life was a misunderstanding. The more I thought about it, the more the truth unraveled in my head. This wasn't about a house. It was about why the house existed in the first place and why nobody wanted me to know about it. And I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever the real reason was, I wasn't going to like it. I stayed in that parking lot for maybe an hour before deciding to drive to the address from the listing. I didn't plan on going inside or anything. I just needed to see it with my own eyes. The drive felt weirdly long, like the universe was giving me extra time to change my mind. When I finally turned onto the street, everything felt quiet. Too quiet. The houses looked older, lived in, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business. The house itself looked smaller than in the photos. The paint on the siding was peeling. The porch light was broken. The blinds inside were half open like someone had looked out recently. I parked across the street and just watched it for a minute. That's when a woman walked out of the house next door carrying a bag of trash. She glanced at me, then at the house I was staring at. I rolled down the window and asked if she knew who lived there. She said nobody had lived there for years. She said the owner passed away a long time ago, and the place had been tied up in some sort of family dispute and legal mess ever since. Her words made my stomach twist because they didn't shock me. They fit too perfectly. Something about the tone of her voice told me she knew more, but I didn't push. I thanked her, rolled up the window, and drove off slowly. I couldn't stop thinking about the phrasing she used. Family dispute. My dad had always been cagey about anything involving his side of the family. And suddenly, the weird dynamics, the secrecy, the hesitation. It all felt connected, even though I still didn't know how. I didn't know if that house was supposed to be mine or if someone just wanted me to think that. But I knew the story went deeper than anyone wanted to admit. I spent the rest of the day circling through every possibility in my mind, none of which made me feel better. I considered calling the realtor listed on the sign, but something told me not to. Not yet. I didn't want to accidentally involve myself in something I didn't understand. Instead, I drove home and sat at my kitchen table again, opening my laptop and searching the address. I found old records, past sales, tax documents, everything I could legally access. One thing stood out immediately. The previous owner shared my last name. Not a common last name. The file showed the property had belonged to a man named Leonard, someone I'd only heard mentioned once in my entire life, in passing, when my dad said he had an uncle who kept to himself. I clicked deeper through the documents, feeling a chill crawl up my neck. Leonard had passed away 9 years ago. 9 years. The same year my grandfather died. The same year my dad went quiet for months. It was like puzzle pieces started sliding into place on their own. Whatever happened back then wasn't separate events. It was one long chain. A chain nobody told me about. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, feeling my pulse thudding in my ears. I didn't know if my dad inherited the house from Leonard or if there were legal complications or family fights he never admitted to. But it was clear the house wasn't new. It wasn't a recent plan. It was a leftover piece of a story my family buried years ago. The part that scared me was realizing they all agreed to bury it together, and I was the only one left standing outside of it. By the time evening rolled around, I knew I needed answers that didn't come from them. I called a friend of mine, someone who works in a small law office downtown. I didn't give him the whole story. I just gave him the name, the address, and asked if he could check anything publicly available about the estate. He said he'd look into it and get back to me tomorrow. After hanging up, I finally sat down on the couch, feeling drained in a way I couldn't really explain. I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt disconnected, like I wasn't part of my own life. That's the thing about family secrets. They don't hit you all at once. They spread slowly, like water seeping under a door. I tried eating something, but nothing went down. I turned on the TV for background noise, but I didn't even register what was on. I kept thinking about how my dad looked at dinner. Tight, rigid, scared, and how he practically ran away rather than talk to me. Whatever this was, it wasn't small. It wasn't embarrassment or a misunderstanding. It felt bigger, heavier, something that had been sitting on him for years. I wondered if he thought he was protecting me, or punishing me, or protecting himself. I wondered if the reason he never told me was because doing so meant admitting something he didn't want to face. After a while, I turned off the TV and sat in silence. And for a moment, the whole situation felt unreal, like I'd just imagined the entire thing. Then I remembered the sign in my car, the listing, the documents, the address. No, this was real. Too real. The next day, my friend called around mid-morning. His tone immediately put me on edge. He said he found the old probate documents, and some of the filings were strange. I asked what he meant by strange, and he hesitated before explaining that there were signatures missing from certain places where all heirs were supposed to sign. And one of the names listed, my dad's, appeared in the file, but next to it was a note that the court had difficulty establishing contact at the time, which made no sense. My dad wasn't hard to reach 9 years ago. Then my friend said something that made my stomach drop. According to the records, there were 2 primary heirs, my dad and his surviving sibling. Except my dad doesn't have a surviving sibling. His sister died when he was younger. That was something I grew up knowing. I asked my friend if the documents listed who the sibling was. He said yes, but asked if I was sitting down. My heart pounded in my ears as I told him to just read the name. And when he did, I felt this cold, heavy silence fall over everything around me. The name listed wasn't my aunt. It wasn't a relative I recognized. It was my mother. My mother, who had divorced my father years before Leonard died. My mother, who never once mentioned being part of any estate. My mother, who had no blood relation to that side of the family at all. I didn't know if it was a clerical error, a lie, or something else entirely, but whatever it was, it didn't make sense. I asked my friend what that meant legally, and he said it suggested the estate filing had been rushed, sloppy, or manipulated. My chest tightened. Suddenly, the secrecy, the tension, the silence, it all felt different. Not protective, not accidental, intentional. My friend said he'd dig more if I wanted, but I barely heard him. I was too busy staring at the wall, trying to process the fact that the story I'd been told about my own family might not be real. Or worse, it might be hiding something none of them ever planned on telling me.